Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. We have 40 people currently, which is a fantastic turnout, and maybe one or two people will come a bit later. My name's Andy Hockley. I'm the coordinator of LAMSIG, which is the IATEFL's Leadership and Management Special Interest Group. We run 3 webinars a year and also some various workshops and face-to-face events. Our next one will be just before the conference, the IATEFL conference in Glasgow, Scotland, in just over a month's time. On April the 3rd is our pre-conference event on ethical and effective recruitment. So if any of you can make it to Glasgow, I think that will be a really excellent day. So, but without further ado, you're here now to hear from Andy Curtis. I've known Andy for probably longer than I want to remember. It's probably getting on for 20 years now. But I think it's probably about 5 years, but I suspect it's about 20 years ago, or 15 at least. We met, first of all, at the School for International Training in the USA, where we were both working. And Andy has just come back from a very, very difficult and onerous work of being a guest visiting faculty university in Hawaii. So, you know, it must be difficult for him to be back in Ontario, Canada, where it's very snowy, as it is here, where I am in Transylvania, Romania. And you're all over the world, which is great to see. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Andy and step out of the way.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy was saying, we've known each other a long time. We've both been interested in leadership and management of language educators for a long time. Andy has been involved with the IDLE team, which is the International Diploma in Language Teaching Management. So we're very happy to have this chance to be with you. I see from the chat bars that we have many different countries here from around the world, from the UK, from Lithuania, the Philippines, from Ireland, Belarus, from Moscow, Italy, and many other countries, Germany, Egypt. So it's still, for me, it's still kind of exciting to be able to do these events live from my home here in Ontario, Canada, as Andy said, from his home in Romania. The weather here is, as I look out the window, is quite snow covered and ice covered, but it's very nice to welcome you all here. Ecuador's just joined us. So I'm going to talk for around 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. You may have questions along the way as we come up, as we go through the slides, and if you can either keep your questions, make a note, or you can send them into the chat bar and Andy will help me keep track of those. So we'll get through the slides. As many of you know, you've attended some of our LAMSIG webinars before. These will be recorded and archived for those of you who are not able to join us. So I will go back to the beginning of the slides, and we will start at the beginning. Often I start at the end. So more and more teachers that I have been hearing from and talking with, especially in the last few years, have been telling me that they are transitioning from primarily teaching and learning into managing and leading. And I see from the chat bar that a number of you are in that situation. So it's becoming more common, I think, in education and language education, that people who have had a lot of training in teaching may not have had a lot of training in leadership or management. And that, for me and for Andy Hockley, has been an interesting dilemma in a way. Why is it that in order to become a teacher, we need many years of training and qualifications and experience. But in moving from education into educational leadership and management, it's often not the case. We're expected to learn the job as we go. So that's why in my work, I've written about teachers going into teaching, because it's a very conscious decision with training and qualifications and exams, and then falling into leadership. So going into teaching and falling into leadership is one way that I think of this distinction and this difference. As we can see on the next slide there, as I've just mentioned, this interesting and problematic difference between all the training that's involved in being a teacher and all the things we're expected to learn on the job as we go in our leadership and management roles. There is, in our field, in language education, relatively little literature on leadership and management in language education. An exception to that is the book that you can see there on the screen. I'm a bit surprised when I went back to that book that next year is 10 years since it was first published, From Teacher to Manager, Managing Language Teaching Organizations. And as you can see, Andy Hockley was one of the co-authors. It's still one of the relatively few books that are published in our field. If you look at the books on language teaching methodology or language teaching technology, or even the politics of language teaching and learning, those are a far greater number of books and papers and articles and conferences on those areas. And when it comes to leadership and management in language education, for some reason, there's far fewer. That is changing, but it's really changing slowly, which is, I think, one of the challenges that many of us have faced and one of the reasons for today's webinar. A little bit about my experience in the areas of leadership and management. My first official presidency was as the president of the Graduate Students Association at the University of York in England, which is where I did my master's and my doctorate. Most recently, with many points in between, but most recently I have been, and still am for a few weeks, in the presidential line of the TESOL International Association. So you spend a year as incoming president or president-elect, and then you are so-called sitting president, which is ironic because you spend most of the year running around. There's actually not a whole lot of sitting, but sitting president and then past president. And I'm finishing up my 3 years as past president at the TESOL International Convention in Seattle next month. So that's been 3 years in a presidential role in the TESOL Association, together with IATEFL. The TESOL Association is the largest international association of language educators in the world, with members in more than 150 countries. So it's been a good 3 years for helping me bring together the previous 20 years of interest and experience in this area of leadership and management. So there are a lot of books, a tremendous number of books on leadership, not in language education, but mostly in the business world, and leadership in healthcare, leadership in hotel management. Most fields seem to have a very substantial literature on leadership, but still not us in language education. So there are a lot of very big, heavy, earnest, serious, expensive books from other fields and from various quotations on leadership. So I've taken to start some of the more light-hearted quotes about leadership. One of my favorite authors, Douglas Adams, famous for his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, those 5 books sold 15 million copies. He tragically died some years ago at the age of 49. And one of his quotes is, as you can see on the screen there, as most of you can see, it's a well-known fact that those people who want to rule people are, by that fact, ipso facto, those least suited to do it. Logically, therefore, anyone who's capable of getting themselves made president should, on no account, be allowed to do the job. So that's an interesting quote for me about motivations. I don't think most of us in language education don't want to be president of anything in particular. We became teachers so that we could teach and learn, but we find ourselves, many of us, eventually in these leadership roles. A Chinese philosopher and writer, author of the Book of Changes, which is relevant because a lot of what we do is agents of change. As leaders and managers, we're often agents of change, and so we'll talk about that. So there is this nice connection over thousands of years between Douglas Adams and Lao Tzu. One of his quotes is, leadership has been defined as the ability to hide your panic from others. Don't panic was a line from the Douglas Adams book. So some interesting connections over the continents and over the centuries there. Some of you may have seen, again, nearly 20 years ago now, an animated film called A Bug's Life from Disney and Pixar. And one of the quotes that I made a note of when I saw that film 19 years ago was one of the creatures in the movie says, the first rule of leadership is everything is your fault, which has not really been my experience, but as leaders, we are expected to take the responsibility for a lot of things that other people do who report to us. So that's certainly one of the challenges of leadership, and we can talk a bit more about that. I'm going to refer to some of the best known names in the field of leadership and management, mostly from the business world, because that's where I started reading the literature from the business world, and I still think that there is a lot that people in the business world can teach us about leadership and management in language education. I would also say it goes both ways. There is a lot that the business world can learn from those of us who are in service roles, like this one as president of TESOL, and those of us who really do what we do without a primary concern for how much profit and how much income we're going to generate. So the business world can learn a lot from education, and I do believe that education can learn a lot from the business world. So Peter Drucker, the Austrian-born American founder of modern management, he developed the idea of management by objectives. He was instrumental in the development of management education. So I'm referring to these guys partly because they've influenced my work and thinking, and also because if you're not familiar with them, they are very good sources to be able to read if you wanted to learn more. And his quote, in terms of distinguishing between leadership and management, is that management is doing things right and leadership is doing the right things. Now, I show that slide partly because of the wordplay and partly because I'm still thinking about this distinction between doing things right and doing the right things. I think what Drucker meant by that is that management is often involved in the day-to-day business of getting things done, whereas leadership is often looking at the big picture, more on the visioning or envisioning side of making sure that you or your organization or your association are moving in the right direction. So I think that's one of the differences between leadership and management. I'd also say that management, for a while there, seemed to have gotten a negative reputation. In America, I think they say a bad rap. That lots of people wanted to be leaders, but somehow being a manager wasn't considered very attractive or very sexy, and management was bad and leadership was good. I certainly don't see it like that. All organizations need good managers and all organizations need good leaders. They do fulfill different roles and responsibilities, but I would certainly not say that one is more important than the other. Warren Bennis, another famous professor and educator in the field of leadership studies, passed away a couple of years ago. He had some interesting distinctions to make between leadership and management. And one of the things he pointed out was, based on his research, which was quite extensive, again, mostly in the American business field, was that managers accept the way things are. They accept the status quo, whereas leaders tend to challenge and question the current situation. And that has been my experience, is that managers are involved with the day-to-day, the essential day-to-day business of making sure things get done, making sure the school or college or university, the department or faculty runs as smoothly as possible. So they're often not interested in bringing about a lot of change because that disrupts the system and that makes it more difficult sometimes to do the management. Whereas leaders are often in a leadership role because they're interested in seeing how things can be done differently or how things can be done more effectively or more efficiently. So that's why I have that note there as leaders as agents of change. And what some of you will already have seen is that these roles definitely overlap with a lot of our work as day-to-day classroom teachers. I see that Andrea has posted about the importance of managers being underestimated, and I would agree with that. And that's why I'm happy that the special interest group for IATEFL, this group is called LAMSIG, Leadership and Management. In the TESOL International Association, the equivalent interest group is called Program Administrators Interest Section. So they've avoided the word leadership and management. I'm members of both groups, but I do like the fact that LAMSIG has notions of management and leadership built into its title there. This interesting question that comes up when people see great teachers or when people see great leaders, they sometimes ask what is sometimes known as the nature-nurture debate, whether great teachers and great leaders are born that way or whether the great teachers and great leaders are made. And as you can see, if you can see that slide there from Warren Bennis, he believes that the idea that leaders and teachers are born that way, that there's this genetic factor to leadership, is, as he put it, nonsense. He said that the myth implies that some people have charismatic qualities or they don't. And there is a sub-area, a smaller area within the leadership literature that focuses specifically on what they call charismatic leadership, which is a really interesting area, this notion of charismatic leadership. So there's some interesting papers out there that you can have a look at. But his idea, and I would agree with this, is that most of the things that make effective, efficient teachers and effective, efficient leaders and managers can be learned. That said, I do think that certain personalities or characteristics can help you be an effective, efficient teacher, leader, and manager. For example, I know some people who are quite shy. They prefer not to speak up in a group. They are extremely intelligent and very articulate. They're just quite shy, and they prefer not to say things in public. And to those people, I've said a high-profile leadership role may not be a good fit for you. People who get very anxious when they have to do public speaking, when they have to give presentations like this to larger numbers of people from many different countries in a live setting. If that's the kind of thing that makes people anxious, then perhaps teaching isn't ideal, and certainly these days high-profile leadership roles involve a tremendous amount of time in front of the camera. Social media has made many of us constantly public all the time. So I think I would say that there are certain qualities and characteristics that help teachers, leaders, and managers, but that on the whole, all of those skills and knowledge and competencies can be learned. So, in terms of connecting language education with leadership and management development, two authors here, again, two authors that I can recommend if you don't know their work, Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. They've been working, publishing and presenting and researching together for some 30 years now, more than 30, and they wrote a book called The Leadership Challenge, again, for the American business market. As you can see, it came out, the first edition, it's had many editions, was more than 20 years ago, getting on for 30 years, sold more than 2 million copies in more than 20 languages. So again, I can recommend looking at that work, and I really did agree very strongly with one of their quotes where they said there's nothing more demoralizing than a leader who can't clearly articulate why we're doing what we're doing. And that sounds true for most of us. Once we hear that, we think, oh yes, that probably is right. We think of good leaders and not so good leaders, good managers and teachers and not so good managers and teachers. And we think of the things that made them that, and one of those things is being able to articulate clearly and concisely the reasons for doing what we're doing. And certainly this is something that I've seen very effective teachers do. As Andy Hockley mentioned at the beginning, I've just come back from 6 weeks as a visiting professor in Hawaii, developing a new course on peace linguistics. Peace linguistics is going to be one of the next new big areas in applied linguistics. So we were piloting a course there in peace linguistics. And one of the things I remember saying to my students who are undergraduate students is that if I ask them to do any task, they should not do it just because I'm their professor and they're an undergraduate student. I should have explained every reason for every task that I'm asking them to do. Otherwise, they should question me. So that, I think, relates very clearly to the quote from Kouzes and Posner about clearly articulating why we're doing what we're doing. There is a tendency to focus on the product, on the end point, and on the process, but I think it's very important to be able to articulate, and you can't do that without language. That's why I think language teachers on the whole, good language teachers, are very good at articulating for their learners why we're doing what we're doing. As I said at the beginning of this talk, the reason for this LAMSIG webinar is that we still believe that there is a disproportionate shortage of materials on leadership and management in language education compared to materials on say, methodology or technology, or the politics, the post-colonial politics of English language teaching and learning. So as I'm looking at the slides, I'm also keeping an eye on the chat bar, and I know Andy Hockley's helping me do that. The idea that whether leadership is acquired through random experiences, and I'm not sure whether I would use the word random, but I would certainly say that many of the experiences that have been most important to me in learning, I didn't predict. I didn't get up that morning and think, okay, I'm going to have all of these very challenging situations hit me today, and I'm going to learn a lot from them. I mostly woke up thinking, I really hope today is not quite as difficult and not quite as challenging as yesterday. It usually was more challenging and more difficult than the previous day. So I don't know if I would say random, but I would say maybe unplanned, unpredicted experiences. And this happens when we're teachers in classrooms, right? We have a lesson plan, we have our materials, we have our textbooks, we have our warm-up and our cool-down, and then we go into class, and the lesson, for all kinds of reasons, the environmental factors beyond our control, loss of power. In Hawaii, we sometimes lost all the electricity. It's a very small island of Oahu in the Pacific Ocean, one of the most remote islands in the world in terms of its distance from any other land mass. We would lose power. There'd be no electricity, there'd be no water, sometimes for hours at a time. So your lesson plans had to take that into account. So most of the skills that I use as a leader and manager come from my experiences as a teacher and as a learner. And as some of you have commented there, reflecting on those, which is what we're doing now, reflecting on those experiences after we've gotten through them or in the middle of getting through them, it's that idea of teachers as reflective practitioners. I don't often hear the term leaders and managers as reflective practitioners, although the notion of reflective practice is beginning to be developed in leadership and management education. But teachers as reflective practitioners has been a big part of our field for a really long time. So that's another reason I think that really effective teachers can be very effective leaders and managers. Tony Blair, who some of you will remember as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for 10 years, when he was interviewed about one of the most difficult things as being the Prime Minister during a tumultuous 10 years, he said, and I thought this was especially interesting, that one of the most difficult things was saying no, and that it was very easy to say yes. Now, we're not going to go back and review the quotes, but if you look at the slides later and you look at the quotes, as I've mentioned, many of those things, I would say most of them, possibly even all of them, apply to teachers. Because one of the interesting dilemmas is that teachers are used to, and I think most teachers in most countries that I've met, I've worked with tens of thousands of teachers in many dozens of countries over the last 25 years, especially over the last 3 years as president of TESOL International. And I would say most of them are inclined to say yes. Their students want more help, yes. Their students need more time, yes. Their colleague needs some support, yes. Can you help me with this, please? Yes, of course. So I think as educators, as classroom teachers, we are to some extent programmed to say yes, to be accommodating, to give more. And a good deal of management and leadership can be somebody asking you for something, as Tony Blair said, and you having to say, I'm sorry, but no. There are 40 or 50 other teachers in this school or college or university, this department, there are 40 or 50 other teachers, and if I give you this thing that you want, then to be fair, I have to give all 40 or 50 other teachers that same thing. So it's interesting, again, from a language point of view, how the very good teachers that I've worked with over the years, in leadership and management roles, we've talked a lot about how to say no. And the challenges of going against our training as teachers in classrooms where we're really used to saying yes, and we're kind of programmed to say yes. So the next section, and then I'm going to look at one kind of particular example, and then we'll go to the questions and answers, and I know some of them have been coming up in the chat bar, and Andy has been helping me keep track of those. So thank you for those, keep them coming, and we will get to as many of them as we can in the last part of this hour. So common problems and pitfalls, and I would, in a face-to-face situation, in bricks and mortar, I'd ask you to see if you recognize these and to tell me if you have had some of these. But over 20 or so years of working with teachers who are in leadership and management roles, often with little or no formal training or qualifications, these are the top 10 challenges that they have told me about, that I've read and written and researched and presented on. One is, the first one that we've talked about, is lack of training and lack of experience. This idea that, well, to be a teacher you need many years of training and education and qualifications and experience, but being a leader or manager in a language education setting, well, you'll just kind of pick it up as you go along, or make it up as you go along. So there is still, I think, a lack of focused, tailored, relevant training opportunities for people coming into management and leadership in language education. The book by Andy Hockley and his colleagues is one of the few that focuses very specifically on that group. Because of the lack of training and the lack of experience, there is often a lack of competence and or confidence. And that is a more complicated relationship than it might seem at first. And again, we see this in the language classroom all the time, that we have students who are very competent in the target language, which may be English, but they're not very confident. Or we have students and learners who are very confident, but actually they don't have an awful lot of the target language. They have very little of the target language, but they love to use it whenever they can. So this relationship between confidence and competence is something I refer to in my work, both for teachers and learners and for leaders and managers. Now, the third one may seem a bit of a contradiction to some people. Can there be such a thing as too much consultation? Yes, there can. I've seen it a lot. And it's because of the points 4 and 5 connect to point 3, which is that as teachers we would like everybody to be on board, and by which I mean everybody to be in agreement before we move forward. And I've certainly seen chairmen of boards of directors and non-profit educational associations want everybody to be in agreement because they're afraid somebody might be unhappy. So the two things I tell them is that if you put a group of intelligent, articulate people in a room, they won't agree on things. If everybody agrees on everything, then somebody's not paying attention. If you're an agent of change and you're trying to bring about innovation, positive, planned, purposeful change, because change can be negative and random, and innovation needs to be positive and planned and purposeful. So if you're trying to bring about positive change and innovation, and you are not meeting any resistance, then you're not doing it right. I've learned to expect people to resist my work as a leader and manager when I'm trying to bring about change. That's what people are supposed to do. Some people. If everybody resists all the time, it's a problem. If everybody agrees all the time, it's a problem too. So there is such a thing as too much consultation, and I find people who have spent most of their life in classrooms are used to a tremendous amount of consultation, wanting a lot of people to agree, everybody to agree, and being concerned that maybe some people will be unhappy with the decision. This is about decision making, and the fact of the matter is there will always be some people who are not happy. They're not happy in themselves, so they're not going to be happy with any decision that you try to get the group to make. So saying no, making difficult decisions, not always having everybody on board and everybody in agreement, having some people be unhappy. And some of you have quickly skipped ahead as I moved the slides ahead, which is great. Not wanting to be disliked. Nobody wants to be disliked. But one of the lessons I had to learn the hard way is that if you base your decision making on wanting people to like you, then you're going to make some very bad decisions. You may be popular, people may like you, but you're going to make some bad decisions. So I used to explain to my staff in the various countries and the various leadership and management roles that I've been in, that my goal is not to not be liked. My goal is not to offend anybody. But I am not going to not make difficult decisions just because people might not like it. That's really not my role. I need to make sure that everybody understands what we're doing, that everybody has had a chance to express their opinion, which might be an opinion in opposition. But if people understand it and people have had the chance to express an opinion, then we'll have to move forward with the decision. That's been defined in the literature as practical consensus. The old model of consensus where everybody agrees with everything doesn't work. It may work in a classroom, it certainly doesn't work in leadership and management. I've seen various leaders who work hard to get the group to reach a decision, and then somebody expresses some doubts and concerns and they want to go back and revisit everything. Again, that may work in educational settings, but it doesn't work in leadership and management situations, because you have to, once you've all agreed, then you need to move forward, and you mustn't wait too long before moving forward. So many of the academics, full-time academics, professional professors that I work with in many universities have a tremendous amount of time for their writing, for their research, and they get very anxious when they're required to make a lot of good decisions very quickly. So good decision making, making it quickly, making sure that once everybody has had a chance to express their opinion, which may be negative opinions, that's okay, that's a good thing. But once that process is done, then you need to find a way to move forward as a group. This question of being intellectual or too intellectual relates to my previous comment, is that you do need to be extremely thoughtful. That's not the same as being intellectual for me. I have met many very accomplished professors at a number of universities around the world who are very good researchers and publish a lot. They're okay as teachers and they're poor as leaders and managers, because every time something comes up, they want to do a literature review, they want to do a survey, they want to gather data. And that's not necessarily the best way to move forward if you have to make a lot of difficult decisions and you have to make them quickly. Being willing to move the organization, move the group forward, even though some people may be unhappy, some people may resist. That's part of your role as a leader and manager. It's not to get everybody to agree to everything all the time, which is what we're more inclined to do as classroom teachers. And as some of you have noticed, some of the world leaders that we're currently faced with, I'm thinking of the previous quote from Douglas Adams about people who should not be president. Being too intellectual is not a problem that we have with many of our world leaders at the moment. In fact, if anything, they're not thoughtful enough, they're not intelligent enough to be a world leader. But the democratic process, such as it is, has given them the nuclear codes. So that's something we can all live with for the next few years. But that is a difference between being intellectual, being intelligent, and being thoughtful. Those are not the same things for me. So, an example. Many of you in many languages will know this notion of the squeaky wheel, which is something that a wheel on a bicycle or on any moving object that squeaks, that makes this noise each time the wheel rotates. And because the wheel that rotates makes noise, it is attended to. So the English expression is the squeaky wheel gets the grease being the oil or the lubricant that makes the wheel move smoothly. You can see the metaphors and analogies of moving forward in leadership and management roles here. So I was trying to find the origin of this notion of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and one set of theories are that it goes back to that poem by the American humorist Josh Billings from the 1870s, in which he wrote, "I hate to be a kicker, I always long for peace, but the wheel that does the squeaking is the one that gets the grease." And I happen to find that in many languages. You can see it there in Putonghua, in Mandarin Chinese, which translates into English roughly as the crying baby gets the milk. You can see it in German, and if any of you speak German, I hope my German is roughly accurate. I'm not going to say it. But the German translation there is the wheel that squeaks the loudest gets most of the fat. And in Spanish, he who does not cry does not get the milk, does not suckle. So I think that is very interesting that should exist in so many languages. Now, how does that connect to teaching and learning and leadership and management? In this way, I believe, is that if you're a teacher in a classroom and you have, let's say, 40 learners, if you're in a very nice situation, you might have 20 learners or even fewer. Most of the classes that I've been in over the last 3 years, which is about 500,000 miles, have around 40 learners. So let's say you're a teacher in a classroom and you have 40 learners, and 4 of them, 10% of the group, is being very problematic, and those 4 are taking about 50% of your attention. So what we have in those situations as a teacher in a classroom is a whole set of decisions and strategies and practices and procedures and processes that we employ as teachers to make sure that that 10% of our group, that noisy, attention-seeking 4 students out of 40, that 10% does not take a massively disproportionate amount of our time, often 50% or more. So making sure that 10% of the group doesn't take 50% of your attention is something that effective, efficient teachers are very good at. The reverse, the corollary, is also true, which is that all of those learners in class who are just quietly getting on, and doing their work, they're doing what you ask them to do, that those learners do not become invisible, in the sense that the teacher doesn't notice them, because the 10% of attention-seeking students are getting 50% of their attention. So the other 90% of the group, most of whom are just getting on and doing their best and trying to get the task done to the best of their abilities, they're not getting your attention because they are not attention-seeking. So I think for me that has been one of many examples where I've seen a teacher in a leadership role, or I've seen a teacher educator in a management role, and I've noticed that that's what they're doing. There are people in the group, on their board of directors or on their executive committee, or on whatever the leadership and management decision-making body is. There are people who are mostly seeking attention and not contributing to the work of the group. And the strategies for leading, managing, dealing and coping with that person are very similar to the ones that effective teachers use in their classrooms. So I'm going to, there is a lot more I could say about this, and if you type my name, there's a number of Andy Curtises out there, but if you type Andy Curtis Leadership in Language Education, there's a number of articles on the LAMSIG website. You'll find some links to some of the articles that I've written on some of the points we've been talking about here. So there is a growing body of literature on leadership in language education, which I've been contributing to in recent years. So we will stop there, I believe, and go to questions. I know some of you have posted questions, so we can respond to some of those questions. We have about 10 to 12 minutes. We set that aside at the end. Thank you for patiently listening to me scroll through the slides there. Now is your time. I recognize some of the names in the chat bar. Some of you have been in the field for a long time with a lot of experience. So this is where we get to go to your questions. I'm just going to scroll back and see some of your comments about cultural or societal factors. This is what is sometimes referred to as the nature-nurture debate. Is it inborn, or do we learn these things? I would say both. I would say that cultural and societal factors should have a big influence, because if you're leading in a particular context, which means that the cultural and societal factors should be a big part of your work as a teacher, as a leader, and as a manager. Gerhard asked about whether leadership across cultures is the same or different. And certainly that's been a big part of my work, working with international associations, language teaching associations. So as Andrea noted in her comment, leadership means different things in different cultures, and in particular I think different styles of leadership. In some of the cultures I've been living and working and teaching and learning, leading and managing in, those cultures are more comfortable with a more authoritarian style of leadership. In other contexts, people seem more comfortable with a more so-called democratic style of leadership. So it's not just that leadership means different things in different contexts. It's that leadership styles and the preference for leadership styles is certainly different in different contexts. Somebody commented there about it being difficult to find great teachers who make effective managers. Yes, that's a really good point. Partly, I think, because the skill set, the knowledge, skills and competencies to be a good leader and a good manager can be very different from those required to be a good teacher and a good learner. I have in my work identified areas of overlap, and I've presented some of those to you here today. But I agree that it can be a very different skill set and therefore people who've been good leaders and managers turn out not to be good teachers and learners, and the other way around. Certainly, the question of whether knowledge makes you a good teacher, a good leader, I would agree with the comment that from Marcos, I think, that said no, just the knowledge doesn't make you anything. It might make you knowledgeable, but it certainly doesn't make you a great teacher or learner, leader or manager. There's questions there about leaving the comfort zone, which is certainly a big part of leaving the classroom. Ahmed had a question about whether management issues are specific. And again, I think that relates to the context that you're in. When I work in resource limited or resource poor context, a lot of the leadership and management is about making sure that the resources are effectively, efficiently, fairly, and equitably distributed to who needs them the most. Whereas in resource-rich environments, it's not necessarily to do with physical resources, it's more to do with time as a resource. So certainly the issues are a product of the context. There is also a comment I see about leaders needing followers. I think that's a good comment. I would say, though, that a very effective skill as a leader is being able to be a good follower. If you can't follow, then you can't lead, in my opinion, in my experience. Good leaders are also good followers. They know how to follow where things are going. And teachers, of course, are very good at following the progress of their lesson. They have a lesson plan, but where are the learners taking the lesson is where the teachers will go with the lesson. So this notion of leading and following is interesting. And it doesn't come up much in the literature. Most of the stuff on leadership is all about leading from the front. My work has been on leading from the periphery, leading from the edges, the margins of society, being a leader in those situations. So I think it's helpful to know how to, if you only know how to lead and you've never followed, then you may not be able to get people to follow you very effectively. So it's good to have experience of both. Comments about communication, cross-cultural leadership, cross-cultural knowledge. Scott in Canada, here in Canada, I should say, talked about the Peter Principle, which I've discussed a lot. For those of you not familiar, it's the idea that managers rise to their level of incompetence, not their level of competence. So this idea that people get promoted to positions where they don't necessarily have the skill and the knowledge and the competence to carry out that position. And some would say we're seeing that Peter Principle in some of our current world leaders. They may have been very good at selling things in the business world. They may not be very good at being world leaders. Other comments about respecting professionalism as managers. Many teachers would say they're not respected as teachers. And so this notion of respect is one of the connecting recurring themes. Andy Gillette asks, if you're a fair and just manager, retain the respect regardless of decisions made. Yes, that's true. The problem or the challenge is that notions of fairness and notions of justice do vary in different contexts. And as Andy pointed out, that can be a kind of a short-term approach. He wrote that it's the kind of manager who has to change jobs every few years and always leaves a mess. Yes, I certainly have spent quite a lot of time. I actually wrote a chapter in a book for TESOL Arabia some years ago called The Manager as Janitor. It was playfully titled A Man-Jan Model of Leadership, because so much of my work was cleaning up the mess created by the people who came before me. So yes, I would say the notion, people think leadership is glamorous. It's often not. It is often cleaning up the messes that other people have made that came before you. So I appreciated that comment from Andy. Andy Hockley has also posted the link to the LAMSIG website, which has mentioned articles. As he said, don't go to them now, but please do feel free to save the address and go to them after we wrap up. There's various articles there. The question of being liked and being respected is also important. As I mentioned on the slides there about people being afraid of not being liked. And nobody wants to be disliked. I don't think people actively seek that. But by the same token, as we mentioned earlier, can be an inherent part of making difficult decisions that people won't like and that will make you unpopular. So being respected, yes, is more important than being liked. Ideally, it would be great to be both well liked and well respected, but often in certain situations you have to choose. So I see there a note from Andy Hockley about moving between the classroom and decision making. Somebody commented, I think Beta commented on my quote from the Bugs Life film, "It's always the leader's fault." That was a playful reference to the fact that you do need to be responsible, often not just for your own decisions, but for the decisions of the people who report to you, and that can be very difficult. I've certainly had a lot of experience of having to take responsibility for things I didn't do, but the people who reported to me did, and that was part of my role, was to share the responsibility for that problem or that mistake. Various postings about cross-cultural leadership and management. That's certainly a huge area in our field, in international education, in language education, different cultures, different languages, leading and managing and teaching and learning in different ways. It's certainly one of the big challenges. Questions of motivating leaders, I think, are also very important. And having a network, being a member of groups like IATEPL's LAMSIG or TESOL International's Program Administrator Interest Section, having those kinds of support groups is extremely important. It's a bit of a cliche, but it can be very lonely to be in a leadership position. The teachers who were once your colleagues are still your colleagues, but they now report to you. So the dynamic of the relationship has changed because the power dynamic has changed. So that can certainly be a challenge. I've been in that situation where people have come to me in the leadership role and asked me for favors to help them out because we used to teach at the same level. So that can certainly be a challenge. Okay, I think we are coming to the end of our hour, and I will pass it to Andy.
Yes, I think we have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, it's been very, very interesting, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed it. But we've had an hour now, so we do have to wrap it up. I think we got to most of the questions. And there were some excellent comments there as well. So if people want to scroll back through the comments, then I do recommend it. There were some very interesting conversations and very interesting comments that came up.
Yes, I was aware of those. Thank you for those. And I think I will certainly go back and have a look at some of those comments. And thank you all very much to everyone for joining us for this hour. It's been very helpful for me to see your comments and see your questions, and we hope it's been helpful for you too.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Andy. I mean, it's been great, and I really appreciate you getting up on the cold Canadian morning after being in Hawaii for 6 weeks, and giving us your time. So thanks very much to Andy, and thanks to all of you for attending.
Yes.
I'm going to turn up my microphone.
Thanks to everyone. We look forward to seeing you at IATEFL in Glasgow soon, and or at Seattle for TESOL International. Thanks very much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, thanks. And the recording of this webinar will be. I'll have to do something with it now, and in about half an hour or so, it'll be available online if anyone wants to review it or to let anyone else know that they can watch it as a recording. So thanks again for everyone.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone. Bye.